Welcome to Training 3 in the Turnover and New Leaf Employee Investment Series. Today, we're going to be talking about assessing turnover and causes of turnover. For those of you who've joined us previously, as you may know, my name is Mary Musa Rogers. I am completing my PhD in clinical psychology and working at CCSI, conducting some of this research. We also have Carson Scott, who has his master's degree in sociology, is currently finishing his master's of social work at Nazareth and has been an integral part of research for this series. And we also have Chris Copeland, who is a former CEO and current director of consulting at CCSI today. So today we're going to talk about assessing turnover, causes of turnover, and organizational aspects related to turnover. We will discuss recommendations for how to use some of these assessments we present, and also discuss assessing in the context of stay and exit interviewing. And we'll also, as always, present additional materials at the end for you to read more thoroughly into if you want. And we only have one more session left. So after this session reviews how to assess causes of turnover, we'll finish our trainings next week with recommendations for how to turn data collection into action. So stay tuned for those solutions. On that note, assessment is important because it helps us identify key issues in our organizations and opportunities for improvement at a variety of levels. Particularly, we can utilize assessment for organizational change, evaluation of leadership and supervisor behavior, and employee behavior. However, it is key that throughout today and as you begin assessing within your organizations and agencies, we do remind ourselves that data is not perfect. It is only as good as our tools of collection, which includes ourselves and our minds, or the people who developed the tool. The biases of those tools and the culture of the people interacting within your organization may change the way that they respond and the quality of the data that you get today. So those are important things to consider as we go through. Along those lines, your organizational culture is key when beginning to conduct assessments. Without fostering a system of trust, assessment can be harmful to employees in a variety of ways, such as when assessing causes of turnover, including burnout, that can lead to a lot of stigma, a lot of discomfort, and potentially harm if not handled in the right ways. Moreover, without any transparency about what the data is used for or follow-up action, assessment can lead to a lot of resentment and further a toxic culture. Thus, while assessment is an important step in addressing turnover, use it with caution. Make sure that you are thoughtful as you are beginning this process. And to get honest feedback from employees, creating trust is a must. Transparent communication around what assessments are being conducted and why they're being conducted is important. And it's also important to consider how assessments are communicated. Is it by email, via group meetings? What is the way you know best reaches your employees? Don't always assume that an email is enough. Before you begin the assessment process, it may be best to sit your employees down in a group or series of small groups, depending on the size of your organization, in person or via Zoom, and explain to them the process that you're about to begin. Explain what you will be assessing, how you're assessing it, how the information will be used, and what you're planning to do with it. Inviting employees to provide feedback is important, which means it must also be met with low defensiveness or resistance from leadership and supervisors. If employees see that the organization is resistant to listening to them, then you might have a larger organizational issue at hand and have to build that trust more. So you'll see there on the right some of those steps to creating trust. And that link at the bottom right will also give you more information about how you can use some of those skills if you need them. Without transparent communication, results reporting, and employee updates, employees will not trust the employer's motives in collecting survey data. Over time, employees will cease to respond or respond only with answers they think the employer wants to hear. And it makes the data collected on the survey useless or very uninteresting. So, even if you think you might be doing something, as I mentioned, what you do with the information is important. So we assess so that we don't have to invest broadly, but in a more targeted manner. As we will discuss in training 4, there are many areas you can invest to reduce turnover. However, if that area is not an area of concern, or if you don't understand the problem well enough in that area, you'll inappropriately invest time and funds into something that will likely not reduce turnover. It's also important to consider how your employees will view your actions. For instance, if you begin assessing burnout and use cutoffs instead of having conversations with employees to make decisions about their ability to work, you're going to foster distrust and they're going to perceive it as punishing. And as we've talked about before, that distinction between punishment and reward is really important. Even if you think you might be doing something that's best for an employee or the organization as a whole, it's important to remember that people deserve to be treated with respect, agency, and autonomy, and that what you perceive to be rewarding or useful might not be the same for your employees. As we know when we work with clients, we can't force people into our perspective, but we have to be willing to have that conversation about it to reach mutual understandings, especially when we have power over them. Finally, when you begin receiving data, it's key that you get comfortable with uncomfortable information. Some information you may want to ignore or disregard because it isn't what you expect or it's a difficult aspect to address, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore it. This is particularly true with regard to diversity and equity, as this quote from Brene Brown states, people are opting out of vital conversations about diversity and inclusivity because they fear looking wrong or being wrong. Choosing our own comfort over hard conversations is the epitome of privilege, and it corrodes trust and moves us away from meaningful and lasting change. This is true across the board regarding difficult topics that you may come across in trying to address turnover. Don't shy away from it. Be willing to have the difficult conversations and sit in the discomfort for a little while. As we'll talk about in training 4, we will have actions that we are able to meet these things with, and it's important for us to recognize where our organization is currently at and how we got there. So, in training 1, we provided a tool to assist in tracking the cost of turnover, as well as a formula for calculating turnover. Research suggests that about 68% of agencies track turnover in some method or form. Most use some form or mixture of quantitative measures, which are measures defined or operationalized by numbers, or qualitative measures, which are operationalized or defined by words or meaning. Agencies that reported quantitative turnover tracking reported tracking these aspects of turnover. Almost 98% reported tracking turnover in general. 65% reported tracking tenure or retention, and only about 16% reported tracking the cost of turnover, which you now have the tool to track yourselves. Other aspects some tracked were first-year resignation rates, so the resignation rate of individuals, how many first-year employees left, and also high performer resignations or regrettable turnover rates. You'll see the 27%. So the turnover of workers that are highly productive and have key skills that you valued in your agency but left for one reason or another. Of the qualitative turnover tracking, about 88% utilize exit interviews, whereas only 30% use stay interviews. We'll talk about this a little more later, but these methods can be very useful for determining causes of turnover, particularly in understanding some of the nuance or the specifics about turnover. 58% used employee engagement surveys and 37% used culture or climate surveys. Qualitative retention tactics used included effective onboarding, which about 65% used, recognition programs, which about 55% used, and then 21% used long service bonuses, 13% used retention bonuses, and 5% created a loyalty program. I just got a message from someone who said the Brown quote, "It's important that the trust works both ways. People can get caught up with using certain words and then being labeled." That's absolutely accurate in terms of the trust has to go both ways. So, as I mentioned, we provided the turnover rate calculation in training 1, which can be calculated by dividing the number of individuals who left over a specific period of time by the number of employees over that same period multiplied by 100 to get the percentage. Overall, retention rate can be calculated by dividing the current number of employed individuals by the number of employees at the start of your measurement period multiplied by 100. Although retention seems like it would be the same, but inverse, there are some potential differences in both the way you may want to calculate retention and turnover and also how they might result. For example, retention doesn't include new hires and is more likely to exclude involuntary turnover. Retention is typically assessed annually, as long-term retention is more interesting than short-term retention, whereas turnover may be assessed in more varied intervals, such as monthly, quarterly, or annually, depending on your needs in your organization. So how might turnover and retention look different? Let's look at a figurative department of 8, which is quite small, but can give us kind of an idea. Say that in the department of 8, 2 people left and were replaced during the measurement period. Using the formulas we provided, that would give us a retention rate of 75% and a turnover rate of 25%, the exact inverse as we expect. However, if during the measurement period 2 positions were vacated twice and filled twice, we would calculate retention the same as we maintained the employee numbers we started with at the beginning of the measurement period, and those same positions were maintained or retained, but the turnover rate has now doubled because of that one position or those 2 positions being filled twice. So hopefully this can explain why both metrics might give a more complete picture between retained and separated employees, and why you might benefit from evaluating both. So when deciding what to measure and what types of assessments to use, qualitative or quantitative, it's important to make sure all terms are defined thoroughly for employees to understand. Have you had multiple people read through the questions of different backgrounds and consider accessibility measures depending on the size of your organization, such as does the evaluation need to be translated into another language, or will people of different backgrounds interpret words the same? For example, something that I get docked on a lot is using the word meaningful, as meaningful, even though it doesn't seem like it is vague and can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So it's important to be mindful about the way that the words are defined and whether or not there's some sort of standard or general interpretation that people can have. Who to target is also important, and whether you collect anonymously, confidentially, or identified is also key. Do you want to approach all employees? If you aggregate the data, maybe you might miss certain aspects or important aspects of certain departments or job positions. As I mentioned above, trust is going to be key if you're going to collect any information identified or even confidential to certain staff. Terms on what? Exit interview, employee. So on all of the above. So someone said terms on what, exit interview, employee evaluations, and staff satisfaction. I'm saying terms on anything that you evaluate your employees on. Anytime that you're having your employees report on their experiences in exit interviews, employee evaluations, staff satisfaction across the board, you want to make sure that those terms make sense to them, especially if you're not using a standardized document. Thank you for asking that. So as I mentioned above, trust is going to be key. So if you collect any information identified, right, like where you know who employees, what they're reporting, or even confidential to certain staff such as HR, it's important for you to consider whether or not that employee is going to respond honestly, or how honestly they might be responding based on the culture in your organization. If you're new to assessing organizational components, it might be beneficial to start by assessing anonymously so that people feel safer providing feedback. It's also useful to consider when to measure. So some types of measurement, such as tracking turnover versus retention, may be more or less useful multiple times a year versus annually. Similarly, depending on what you're measuring, you'll want to shift how often you measure and make sure to balance it with your employees' availability to complete the data collection and your ability to use it. So you want to be careful about creating a distrusting environment by assessing once a month, but then not making any changes for 6 months. That can create a resentful or stressful environment where very little is reported. It's also important to consider when to assess in terms of external stressors that may impact reporting timelines. So if it's around a holiday time, it may not be best to evaluate employees, as they'll be less likely to complete whatever evaluation you're conducting in a timely manner or respond with effort. Furthermore, be mindful of other cultures' holidays. For example, today is the last day of Ramadan. So be thoughtful about when you're going to give these evaluations to your employees as we go through the different kind of examples today. Timelines of how long you give employees to complete and if they need to use at-home time to complete it will impact response as well. So some potential areas to examine in addition to just evaluating turnover and the cost of turnover. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's a start to some areas you may want to evaluate, and we'll provide some examples of some measures you could use and how it's recommended to use them. Once again, I must stress that trust is key in evaluating any of these, but particularly when assessing individual stress, as it can be harmful if done inappropriately. So as we mentioned in the causes of turnover, assessing some of those aspects may be meaningful when applied with actions. Particularly, the organizational components can be extremely useful. You'll see value discrepancy again up there, but also some organizational culture pieces, work climate, leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, if you are going to assess some of these individual stress components, such as compassion fatigue or burnout, you might use something like the ProQual, which some of you may have heard of before or used before. This is generally recommended for human service professionals and measures compassion satisfaction, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress. As mentioned before, measuring individual stressors comes with a lot of distrust, stigma, and fear. So it's not recommended to assess this organizationally as a whole, and it must be accompanied with a trauma-informed response. One method could be to provide the scale for employees to use and evaluate themselves periodically, preferably monthly, but not less than quarterly. In a trusting environment, using the questions from the ProQual, you can also structure maybe a one-on-one discussion between supervisors and subordinates, which can also be beneficial. Communicating the importance of these factors to your employees in a trusting manner is the most important aspect. And if an employee can use some of these questions to evaluate for themselves that they would like further support, that should be met with equitable support from their organization. So here I'm showing you some of the questions from the ProQual. It's 30 items long, and you'll see the cutoffs for the compassion satisfaction subscale here on the bottom right. So the inverse of that would be compassion fatigue, which we talked about in training too. The ProQual has similar subscale scoring for burnout and secondary traumatic stress. So you can see how some of these questions could be formulated for a supervision meeting, such as, I feel invigorated after working with those I help, or I feel connected to others. So using those questions to kind of evaluate, hey, like, how are things going? How are you feeling in connection to your patients or your clients? How are things going in terms of, your connection to other employees here, or things like that? You can use these things to kind of garner or start some of those conversations to more informally evaluate. Some things to consider if you are going to use the ProQual. Some recent research demonstrates that cutoffs are not consistently reliable across all demographics. So because the scoring criteria is very clear, employees may be likely to underreport. It's also best when used multiple times to track changes within an individual rather than using the cutoff. So if you have a person tracking themselves monthly on the ProQual individually, they can kind of see for themselves, as you would with a client, the changes over time. Oh, wow, I've had a really stressful month. I didn't realize that I was experiencing more symptoms. Maybe I should request more support from my supervisor or my organization right now. But again, due to the stigma associated with burnout and secondary traumatic stress, you really have to build that environment of trust. It's necessary for this to benefit employees. So overall, it can be useful for employees who have never seen standardized reporting criteria and can be the basis of healthy conversations for support, but it has to be done within a trusting and kind of a supportive environment. As we mentioned moral injury previously, there is a newly developed moral injury symptom scale for healthcare professionals. This measure, similar to the ProQual, has sensitive questions that are not appropriate for organizations to ask directly, but to have employees evaluate for themselves and consider how their workplace setting may be impacting them. The potential benefit of this questionnaire is that, for one, it's short, it's only 10 questions, and it may allow for human service workers to evaluate some of their workplace difficulties in a new or varied way, or in a way they may perceive better suits them than by discussing something like burnout or secondary traumatic stress. The questions are as followed, rated from 1 to 10 with a not applicable indicator. So you have questions like, I feel betrayed by other health professionals whom I once trusted. I feel ashamed about what I've done or not done when providing care to my patients. Most people with whom I work as a health professional are trustworthy. I have a good sense of what makes my life meaningful as a health professional. All in all, I'm inclined to feel that I'm a failure in my work as a health professional. And then you'll also see at the end, more spiritual, religious related questions. I sometimes feel God is punishing me for what I've done or not done while caring for my patients. After the 10 questions are asked, there's one additional question, which is, do the feelings you indicated above cause you significant distress or impair your ability to function in relationships at work or other life areas that are important to you? In other words, if you indicated any problems above, How difficult have these problems made it for you to do your work, take care of things at home, or get along with other people? So instead of a cutoff, you have this self-evaluation of impairment. So this measure may be more sensitive and serious for employees to evaluate, and using it may be validating, but only if workers are met with the appropriate support and action from their organizations. This may be beneficial to use later down the road if there are other organizational factors that need to be addressed first. It's also important to consider that due to the newness of this measure, it isn't standardized or validated across all human service worker types. And it also has that spiritual component that researchers state is necessary to moral injury as a concept, but may not be applicable to some. So that's why they have that NA selection. So the one nice thing also is that the cutoff is more variable as it relies on the individual to report how much impairment or distress is occurring rather than creating a cutoff based on aggregate data. So just some things to consider if you would like to use something like that. So now that we've assessed more of these individual stressors, let's evaluate more organizational factors. The Copenhagen psychosocial measure presents questions regarding an employee's workplace environment that may be impacting their health and well-being. This is recommended for organizational data collection in something like a survey, or used to structure small group conversations to collect more qualitative data. Communicating about why you are collecting and what for is helpful for employees to see the benefit of responding honestly. So having that transparency from the get-go is especially useful when collecting some of these organizational pieces. The Copenhagen psychosocial ends with a section about general health that I don't recommend employers generally collect. It's usually used more in research and less in an organizational standpoint, but all the sections previous to the health section have organizational merit. So, for example, some questions ask about quantitative or cognitive demands, such as whether your workload is unevenly distributed or if you have to remember a lot of things to do your job well. Some of these aspects can also be useful to consider in defining job roles as well. So when you have an individual who's in a particular role and answering these questions, that can provide some clarity in terms of what areas are more or less demanding, or what kinds of demands that they're being asked to do this work. Another series of questions asks about emotional demands, such as, is your work emotionally demanding? Many in human service work would say yes, but then the organizational follow-up, does your work require then that you hide your feelings or that you don't state your opinion? That can be a harmful contrast to consider, but is useful in understanding how the organizational piece can impact a worker whose job is requiring them to put a lot of emotional work in. Other aspects that are organizationally useful includes commitment to the workplace, meaning of work, influence at work, possibilities for development. Notice how many of these reflect some of the causes of turnover we discussed previously, right? That possibilities for development piece being really key to a lot of people's choice to laterally change jobs, even if that doesn't mean that they'll get a promotion at their next job immediately. Furthermore, predictability and role clarity. I think these questions are really great. Things like, are you informed well in advance concerning important decisions, changes, or plans for the future? I suspect that some people hearing that might laugh, considering that some aspects of human service work will always be urgent and requiring a lot of flexibility, right? But it's also interesting to consider how much of an extent is the organization able to communicate, right? There's an important evaluation of communication there, but also the role clarity piece. Do you know exactly how much say you have at work? Does your work have clear objectives? Is it clear to you what your job role is? Those things can indicate problems potential in onboarding, for example. Then we have role conflict, which includes questions such as, are contradictory demands placed on you at work? Do you sometimes have to do things which seem to you to be unnecessary? Do you do things at work which are accepted by some people but not by others? Or quality of leadership, which asks questions about immediate superiors. Does your immediate superior give high priority to job satisfaction? Are they good at work planning? Are they good at solving conflicts? So some of those leadership evaluations are in there as well, which can be useful in determining some pieces around how opportunities for improvement for certain managers or supervisors. So These questions still rely a lot on individual employee report, but focus more on those organizational components that impact employee stress and that you can have more control over as an agency. The questionnaire is longer due to this, but may need to be evaluated less often, as the data from one instance could be useful for something up to 6 months of setting goals and targeted intervention. It may be best to collect from the whole group anonymously, as some of the questions may be uncomfortable to respond to, particularly some of those supervisor questions while identified. However, some of these questions about workloads and demands may also be useful to know about specific roles and could be evaluated during something like an exit interview. So you can see how, hopefully you can see how you can use some of these questions across a variety of contexts. Then we have value discrepancy, which, as discussed previously, is important to ascertain potential value or cultural differences between employees and their organization. This measure is shorter, but may be useful to include in the annual or biannual assessment with something like the psychosocial inventory. You'll show your employees a list of values and have them rate or rank them for themselves, and then rate or rank the organization's values. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here. So I did show you this slide before, but we also now have some sample language you can use within like the context of something like an exit interview or a stay interview. So please rank each of the following values as a life guiding principle for you. 1 indicates the value is not at all important to you. 11 indicates the value is of the most important for you. And here you have 11 values. So by no means is this an exhaustive list, right? So it might be beneficial to consider adding something like a 12th other category for them to add in if you feel like there might be something else here that they'd want to add for them to rank. And then you would have them rank how your organization would rank each of the following values. So again, 1 indicates the value is not important to the organization, 11 indicates the value is of most importance to the organization, so how they would perceive. So this is kind of an interesting quantitative measurement to evaluate discrepancies in values, but you may need an individual somewhat skilled in analysis to fully capture the data in the variety of interesting ways that it might, in the variety of interesting ways it can give you. So a more simple way that you could go about it could be that you take the average rating for each value across all employees and compare from individual to organization visually. So if we go back to this, you have power, achievement, self-direction, equality, benevolence, tradition. Say that someone ranks themselves, the average power score from employees for themselves is something like a 5. And then maybe they rank power for the organization and the average score is something like a 7 or an 8, right? So you can quickly see where those discrepancies are by just visually comparing without having to run any sort of like fancy statistical analysis, unless you want to do that, which is also kind of fun. But then you can also see where maybe you have an individual who says that for them, their value of respect for cultural differences is something like a 9 or 10. And maybe they think maybe the average organizations is something like a 2 or 3, right? So then those really high discrepancies could be an easy place for you to target. Okay, I see that a lot of our employees are reporting that this is a really high value for them and that we're not really meeting up with that. So that's something that's an area that immediately you can start to consider for targeted intervention. So it's also important for you to consider something like demographics while assessing this, because values are very culturally laden. So it's important for you to consider, even if you're going to assess it maybe anonymously, for you to be able to get some demographic information like gender, race, ethnicity, maybe even country of origin or something along those lines, because that can then provide some information about how inclusive your work environment is. Perhaps you have a majority cultural group that identifies pretty closely or doesn't have a lot of value discrepancy, but then you have some members of your workforce that have higher levels of discrepancy. Okay, I have a question that, in regards to role conflict, specifically, do you do things at work that are accepted by some but not others? How would you address this within a larger program that has multiple supervisors with differing expectations? They all supervise different staff, but staff talk and know what expectations are different for others. So I appreciate that question. We're going back a little bit here, but we'll go back because I think that's a really good question. So in the Copenhagen psychosocial, you have this. Do you do things at work which are accepted by some people but not by others? And so we have a question highlighting the differences between supervisors, which obviously employees are very familiar with. I think the way to address this might depend a little bit, but I think that the immediate response that I would have is, how clearly are those things communicated? So I think that some degree of role conflict is likely to occur when you have a larger organization with multiple supervisors. But as long as those things are very clearly stated from supervisor to supervisor, that can help employees address some of those different expectations. It's not that role conflict in itself is inherently bad, but that then being met with high levels of communication and support around being able to match or meet those needs. And is that also being, is that a high demand for them in addition to a lot of other high demands, right? So where are places where maybe we can reduce some of the employees' demands? And we can talk a little bit more about that at the end. I'm going to save that question for now, but I appreciate it's a good question. And we will talk a little bit about how to intervene once we assess as well, in part 4 especially. So a measurement of leadership, as mentioned in the last training, may be useful, particularly when considering supervisor-supervisee conflict, and if there are certain supervisors or managers that consistently have conflict where there may be areas of improvement for them. Once again, this measure allows for discrepancy to be examined by having employees anonymously, ideally, rate supervisors and having the supervisor then self-evaluate where they think they are on these different rubrics. After last time, I'm just kind of curious if anyone took a look at this or self-assessed, or if there are any surprises in what this questionnaire considers important to leadership. Just going to give people a second if they wanted to chat in. I think that we know a lot of these soft skills are important to leadership, especially the social perceptiveness and social dexterity. I think that sometimes we forget to evaluate ourselves where we are on that. Well, and maybe nobody had time, which understandably, to self-evaluate, but we can talk about it more at the end too if somebody wants to jump in toward that time. So finally, in addition to other aspects, evaluating diversity, equity, and inclusion aspects is very important, and there are many ways to do it. If you don't already know, it may be important to evaluate existing diversity within the organization, and not just race or ethnicity or gender, but other components such as languages spoken in the home, or education levels, or state or country of origin. Especially when working in human services, how do the identities of your employees or even cultural values of your employees match the population of clients and community members served? And how might their backgrounds influence the types of care they provide or the choices that they make as human service providers? These are the things that we want to consider early on in our diversity, equity, inclusion work. Furthermore, organization evaluation includes questions about how diversity, equity, and inclusion are included in day-to-day operations, and how much diversity is valued as evaluated by employees. Generally, given the sensitive nature of this topic and difficulty for organizations to address it from within, it's usually recommended that external consultation may benefit in terms of assessment, especially in reducing aspects of assessment that we've talked about before, such as bias and also receiving honest feedback. Sometimes these topics can get really sensitive, and it's hard for employees, even when working with internal HR, to be honest about the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece. As for times for evaluation, a stay interview may be important to consider. Stay interviews are designed to learn what is keeping an employee at an organization. Without a foundation of trust, it will be difficult to guarantee honest feedback, but the information can be important to collect. Furthermore, question design will be critical, as questions that appear leading in nature can skew results and prevent you from learning what you need to learn to improve. Most stay interviews measure things like employee satisfaction and engagement, but can also assess some of the components that we talked about above, especially focused on the Copenhagen Psychosocial Inventory. So as mentioned before, just to kind of give you some information, employee satisfaction describes whether employees are happy and fulfilling their desires and needs at work. Higher employee satisfaction is related to higher productivity, motivation, and lower symptoms of burnout. It is important that if evaluating satisfaction, it's done in conjunction with something like consistent performance evaluation. Employee satisfaction, while generally a positive in your organization, can also become a problem if mediocre employees stay because they're satisfied and happy with your work environment. But surely, oh, somebody said the audio went out. Can people hear me?
You're fine. I can hear you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. If you're still having technical difficulties, also you can message our host. So, as I was saying, employee satisfaction, while generally positive, can be a problem, right? If you have an employee who's really satisfied but isn't really producing or productive. But surely, if you identify mediocre employees that are staying in your organization, that can require effective performance management and constructive feedback. So that's still information in terms of what needs to be targeted here. So we have a lot of satisfied employees, great. So we don't need to work on a lot of these areas of employee satisfaction, but a lot of our employees are not really meeting effective performance, like our performance standards. So we need to work on some of the feedback pieces. Recommended measurement for employee satisfaction are things like anonymous surveys, small groups, or one-on-one meetings, and mostly during work hours. And this is generally true for most evaluations, that if you can conduct them during work hours, which I know seems really difficult in the general busy day-to-day, you're more likely to get effortful answering from your employees. And it will also let your employees know that this is a priority to you, that it is important to them to hear what the employees have to say. So it also communicates some of the importance of that to them. Employee engagement, as the other side to that, is the extent to which an employee is committed and connected to their organization. High employee engagement is related to higher retention and higher productivity. It is important to evaluate engagement in conjunction with values, as most employees with high engagement feel their values match with the organization's values, which makes sense. It's much more difficult to be committed and connected if you feel your organization doesn't match with you and what's important to you. Engagement can be difficult to evaluate, and it's generally recommended to assess it, again, anonymously via something like a survey or by external consultant rather than in person or identified, as honest feedback is difficult to provide because most people want to seem in line with their workplace, especially if they're interested in moving up or staying there. So it's recommended that it's evaluated about every 6 months or quarter, depending on the length of questions and how many employees are evaluated. But again, this depends also on how often you're able to act on some of this information. Stay interviews should be at least twice with new hires during their first 3 to 6 months. So you want to evaluate, you want to conduct something like a stay interview early and more often with new hires in their first year. Established employees should have a stay interview at least once per year opposite their annual review. So these are the best practices or recommendations. The format is going to vary depending on how much trust is built into your organization and what you're evaluating. If evaluating organizational components such as the Copenhagen Psychosocial, an interview may be useful to gather more qualitative information about their perception of the organization's values, and also just the organizational kind of components of their job and what they might find beneficial or satisfying about their work. If asking about engagement or diversity, equity, and inclusion, an anonymous survey may be more beneficial because, again, those things are hard for employees to report on and feel comfortable reporting on honestly when identified. It's also important to consider a different person from the direct supervisor to conduct the interview. Research generally supports that interviews conducted by a supervisor at least once removed, in terms of either a supervisor's supervisor or a supervisor who doesn't directly work with that employee, they're more likely to get successful feedback and honest feedback from the employee. So being thoughtful about who's conducting the data collection is important. As mentioned above, what the information is used for and how that's communicated is important to a successful stay interview. When employees feel they're heard and listened to, they're more likely to provide feedback that's honest and necessary for growth. How do you communicate with them that with them your gratitude for completing a stay interview by acting upon the information they provided in a clear way. So, right, the important thing here is that the best way to provide gratitude for getting information is using it. We've heard feedback that our organization would improve transparency and hiring practices around diversity, equity, inclusion. We'll be examining our hiring practices, releasing an updated procedure for others to examine by date, right? So giving transparent communication to employees about what you're using information for, how you're going to use it, and even if you can, giving them a general timeline about when you're planning to use it, will let them know that their information and their voice is important to you. And that in itself is an equitable practice. Exit interviews are similar to stay interviews in that they're typically similar in format, such as an interview, but are conducted with employees leaving the organization. The format and questions are important, and it's natural to assume that the quality of information will vary based on what resulted in the turnover and whether the employee expects to need a recommendation or reference again in the future. But are still really key to getting some information and some feedback about why employees, especially regrettable turnover, so like employees that you really wanted to keep based on their productivity or skill set, what they have to say about what could be improved in the organization or agency. If the exit interview is conducted with a direct supervisor, there may be more discomfort than if it's conducted with HR or external consultants. And furthermore, a hybrid of interview and survey may provide a more complete picture than either one separately. So according to a recent study in 2016, and I say recent, I know that's still a little bit a while ago, but 71% of HR departments typically handle the exit interview process, whereas 19% have direct supervisors do it. 9% have direct managers do it, and 1% turn to external consultants. Only 8% reported having more than one interviewer, and only 4% reported using questionnaires at all. So some thoughtfulness about, again, what I was mentioning before, that hybrid component may be useful. Having more than one interviewer available may be useful, particularly when you consider what we talked about in causes of turnover, as far as, over a third or around a third of employees are reporting stressors from their supervisors. And so having a direct supervisor then conduct the exit interview is likely to decrease the honesty of them reporting. As far as results from exit interviews, less than a third of leaders could name a specific action that came from exit interview information, and less than a third of organizations reported sharing data regularly with senior decision makers. Knowing this, does it make sense that we expect high quality information from employees? Probably not. As for timing, the best time to conduct an exit interview is about halfway between when they announce their intent to leave and leaving, as the intent to leave may come with negative emotions that may be communicated more strongly in the interview if you conduct it immediately. But then if you wait to their last week of work, they may be so checked out, they're unwilling to provide really a lot of information or give an effortful answer. So some research also suggests that 1 month after an employee leaves can be a good time, particularly if you have like a high productive or regrettable turnover, as those employees may be more likely to provide honest feedback at that time. But then you also have the potential issue of getting a hold of them. So again, that in-between time might be the best time or easiest time, and the 1 month after they leave might be also an opportunity. Interviewers should be trained to listen more than they talk and to avoid displays of authority. They should be patient and friendly, occasionally asking open-ended questions, speaking only enough to prompt the interviewee or steer the discussion toward an important topic. And they should refrain from discussing fixes or problems or like fixes for any of the problems that surface. For example, if a departing employee says the company requires too many signatures for contract approval or too many signatures for documentation, a skilled interviewer will ask him or her to recommend a solution that won't talk about possible company responses. Don't try to fix issues in the moment. Allow the employee to vent and to be listened to. Don't second guess what they're saying. But again, the training is critical. So like given the emotional nature of most resignation, it takes skill to really reach the heart of the matters, which is why, again, something like a hybrid model of survey plus interview can be useful. All right, and so we have an exit tool for you to review, and I am going to share that over for y'all, and Carson is going to review that. So hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes.
Wonderful. All right, Carson, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, my name is Carson, and as Mary said, I will be presenting the exit interviewing model. But before we get to that, I first just want to reiterate and emphasize a few of the things that Mary has already shared with you. As Mary touched on, there are a number of factors that may inhibit participation in any survey method, let alone exit interviewing. One significant factor is that the individual may perceive completing the questionnaire as non-beneficial or just another display of bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. Ultimately, and unfortunately, this is not frequently that far off from the truth. Exit interviews not only can bring clarity to an employee's motivation to leave, but can provide you with potentially vital insights into the work-life balance of your employees and their interpretations of the workplace culture. But too frequently, the information is not dispersed amongst upper management. Their voices go largely unheard, and no noticeable change or adaptations occur. So before all else, step one is to make a conscious decision that exit interviews are important to your organization and to determine how you will communicate and respond to the data obtained. Be direct and open when conveying your intentions with your exiting employee. Whether in counseling or supervision, people respond to sincerity. Another aspect that Mary brought up is that organizations frequently overlook the value of standardized survey or questionnaire data, specifically those that can be taken online. The benefit is that online surveys are efficient, more reliable, less confronting, and less likely to be affected by interviewer bias. This is important because these are factors that can affect the validity and honesty of the answers you receive. Additionally, the data these methods generate can then be used to more efficiently and effectively inform and direct any additional open-ended face-to-face exit interviewing you may wish to do. How you decide to structure your exit interviews largely depends on what you are trying to achieve. Close-ended questions, such as those using a Likert scale where you rank things between 1 through 5 or 1 through 10, least to best, or rankings or multiple choice questions, are more conducive to data pooling and trend analysis. The results can be transferred to an Excel file and pooled over time to draw out overall trends. Open-ended questions, those like fill in the blank or just open comment questions, are useful for clarification, detail, and identifying those unique or outlier concerns and extenuating circumstances that may crop up from time to time. It is always fruitful to add an option to closed-ended questions that allows for some amount of additional commentary. However you decide to structure your exit interviewing questions, it is important to keep in mind that simplicity and brevity are both key factors in response rate. Just as in economics, those faced with surveys of any sort tend to do a quick cost-benefit analysis to determine if completing the survey is worth their time. On the one hand, if you can convey the utility of completing the questionnaires, for example, by communicating your sincerity to take their words to heart, or by appealing to their affection for their coworkers and the desire to make the organization better for their sake, you can raise the perceived benefits. Conversely, if you can reduce the amount of time it takes to complete the survey through utilizing fewer questions with more precise language, you can reduce the perceived cost. In this model, which will be available on the TAC website, we are providing a few examples of how you can format your interviews in a way that can provide you with useful data in as little as 3 questions. Ultimately, these are just a guide and should be tailored to your organization's specific needs. The first question we wish to understand concerns the reason for departure. Depending on how comfortable you are with interpreting data, the question can be offered as either which of the following most closely matches your primary reason for leaving, or which of the following factored into your decision to leave and how influential were they to that decision, in which the exiting employee is allowed the opportunity to not only select the factors, but can assign them a value on a 5-point scale ranging from slightly influential to being highly influential. You then want to provide an array of reasons that adequately captures potential conscious motivations for leaving. If you look at the motivations we have chosen to list, it is obvious that the reasons for turnover may vary greatly. Some are directly related to the policies, practices, and day-to-day life of the organization. Others may have very little to do with the organization, reflecting external forces to the organization that may appear to be beyond the organization's control. Additionally, they can also be considered extrinsically motivated to the exiting employee, representing social, relational, and environmental factors, or they may be intrinsically motivated, stemming from personal desires, stresses, and motivations. Based on these differences, we have developed the 4 domains of voluntary turnover as a way of conceptualizing the data based on the various spheres of influence that may drive turnover. These domains may each require a different orientation and approach when looking to prevent future turnover, and reflect the complexity of the work-life balance and the sometimes conflicting nature of social roles. Your employees are more than just your employees. They may be parents, they may be children, they may be caregivers, and it's important to understand and recognize the place of those roles. It's important to note that those factors falling within the organizational spheres of influence, such as on the left side of this chart, may feel more obvious in the ways that you can influence them, while those external factors, such as marriage, childbirth, the desire for a career change, or to pursue additional education, may feel largely out of one's hands. However, if you find that these external forces play a significant role in your turnover rates, it may be worthwhile to invest in some creative approaches, for example, by offering on-site childcare or supplementing the cost of off-site childcare, or providing more on-site education and training opportunities as a way to pacify the desire to pursue further education. So these practices can be used in conjunction to what you learned in your first module about what the costs are to decide where you want to invest and what things you may wish to do. Ultimately, the important thing is to find a useful way to organize and visualize your data that will allow you to devise an effective response. The final 2 questions work in tandem. As we have discussed within our previous models, value discrepancies can play a significant role in turnover intention. These questions can provide further insight into not just why people leave, but why they stay, and provides an opportunity to further identify potential areas of focus. The first question, please rank the following work aspects in terms of their importance to you, helps to identify the values of the employee. What is most important to them as a worker? The second question, on a scale of 1, strongly disagree, to 10, strongly agree, please indicate how well you think the organization facilitated these aspects of your work experience. This identifies the exiting employee's subjective interpretation of the organization's culture. How closely do these values of the employee sync to their perception of the values of the organization? Is there a substantial disconnect? How does their subjective perception of the organization's values compare to what your own interpretations are as management? Is the organization effectively conveying its values to its staff? Again, this data can help you identify areas of focus and more efficiently direct any further face-to-face interviewing you may wish to do. As Mary already touched on, a common question about exit interviewing is when should they be administered? And she mentioned some of the issues that can occur when emotions are running high. And so for face-to-face interviewing, as she said, typically anywhere within a week to a month is a proper time to do those kind of things. But as far as if you were doing an online survey, something a little less threatening, the common perception is that you want to get it as close to the moment of resignation as possible, all things considered. There's an impulse to let the employee take some time to cool off or to settle their thoughts. However, it's important to try and capture the employee's thought process and emotional state as clearly as possible at the moment when they arrived at the decision to resign. Time can dull emotions and allow for the development of alternative justifications beyond what may have actually triggered the resignation. So some things to take into consideration, but please take it on a case-by-case basis. Furthermore, I wish to emphasize the need to make the process as least threatening and least uncomfortable for the exiting employee as possible. Interviewers need to be impartial and ideally completely unrelated to the employee's cause of separation. If you plan to forego a third-party interviewer, leave defensiveness at the door. Use empathetic statements to de-escalate and encourage honesty and openness within your employees. Fear of retribution is another very real cause for employees either skipping the exit interview process or giving false feedback. Lastly, I wish to emphasize the need to adapt the practices mentioned here to suit your specific organization's need. Keep things simple and only ask things if they have value to your organization. Keep your objectives in mind. You know your staff and your culture best. But know there are resources always available to you. With that, I'd like to turn things back over to Mary.
So hopefully we are back on the PowerPoint slides.
Yep.
We have some questions. So we're running a little low on time, but so just to finish up, I went up one. Just to reiterate one last time, the exit interview should be a culmination of a series of conversations with employees about retention, wellness, and organizational culture evaluations. As Carson was saying, really this shouldn't be the first conversation an organization has with their employees about their feelings and ideas. And so general recommendations are to remind yourselves to actively listen to your employees, ask what they need earlier rather than later, thank them and build credibility and accountability with them. That what you do with data is just the most important part, and how you communicate is even more important. So it's key to really hear employees, but also to speak through your actions and words with them that you're listening. Depending on the topic, how often you evaluate, once or twice a year can be good for organizational aspects, and monthly to quarterly can be better for things like individual stress. But in general, like Carson was saying, your organization best and what it needs best. So we have one last turnover. We are going to talk, we had some questions earlier about kind of what to do with information, that kind of thing. We are going to talk about that more in our final piece. So once you have evaluated, what can you do? And we do have some additional reading materials. All of these slides and everything will be found on the TAC website for you, including the exit interview tool. And we have one question that I wanted to address, because now we're at the question and answer session. And if all of you would just make sure that you ask your questions to all panelists. If there's something we can't get to today, we'll try to address it in the next time if we can. Someone stated, we're often unable to get reasons for someone leaving as they simply stop showing up and we're unable to reach them. I would say about 50 to 60% are considered job abandonment. Any suggestion for determining the reason or where they may fall in terms of most likely? So I think that's a really great question. And I think my initial answer is to focus again on that the exit interview isn't your first time communicating with them about these things, that you're starting to have these conversations now with the employees that are currently there, so that you can hear them out, and then maybe you can start to use that data to track the individuals who are most likely to abandon their role. So that way you can start to figure out the pattern behind who is leaving without communicating. And maybe you can start to figure out some of the reasons why they don't feel comfortable communicating. And some of that, again, might be external, but some of that might be internal to the trust or what the organizational culture is in your agency. I know that might be all the time that we have today. I don't know if anyone else wanted to jump in on that. What's the name of this eval exit interview model again? Carson, is there a name for this model, or is it just the?
So if you are referring to specifically the 4 domains voluntary turnover, there's that. As far as just the rest of the model, it's just simply an exit interview model.
Okay.
I don't know if
So
there's a specific name. It's more of a conglomeration of various models that exist.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And just to quickly answer that last question, which is would you ever suggest doing this process within specific programs, even if the entire agency does not adopt it, or it's problematic if not done for the entire agency? I think obviously, you know, the entire agency is ideal. Okay, I'm gonna save some of these questions too because we are at time. But I think generally, it is ideal if done within the entire agency. I think it depends on how much autonomy the individual department has in making certain procedural or policy changes that will better impact that department. I definitely think there is merit to assessing within a department to make some of those changes, and we can talk about that more next time. And then someone asked, can you share, and of course I just want to go ahead and let everybody head out if they need to. Can you share any specific resources or examples? Do you mean for the exit tool? I'm not sure what you mean sharing specific resources or examples. Thank you all for your time today.
Yes, thank you for being here, everybody. And I will be posting the recording slides and the tool onto the link that I posted in the chat. And if you wouldn't mind also taking our Qualtrics feedback survey that I also put in the chat, that would be much appreciated. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Thank you all.